love Twitter.
I know.
All right, folks, so it's 11:20, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So today I am really excited to introduce Dr. Katey Cooper as our seminar speaker this week. She's an assistant professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. She earned her PhD in biology at ASU with a focus on biology education research. And Katey has an impressive academic record. So as an early career researcher, she's already published over 40 peer-reviewed papers in top journals in our field. And she's given over 50 invited talks, so she's a pretty seasoned speaker. Her work has been highlighted in outlets like Science Magazine, as well as outlets like New York Times, the CNN, and the BBC. So she's a PI of several NSF grants, most recently an NSF career grant that she was awarded to study undergraduate and graduate student mental health, which she's going to share some of that work with us today. Please join me in welcoming Katey.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here today to share with you some of my research coming from my lab, examining the impact of research and teaching on grad student mental health. All right. As you may or may not know, back in 2018, an article was published declaring a graduate student mental health crisis after finding that grad students were more than 6 times as likely to report both anxiety and depression compared to their peers in the general population. As you might imagine, there were calls to then improve grad student mental health, but something that was missing from those was understanding what aspects of grad programs actually needed to be changed in order for grad student mental health to improve. So there was some research into the factors affecting grad mental health. Recently, there were published survey studies that sought to uncover different aspects of graduate school that affect mental health, and they identified that poor mentor-mentee relationships, financial stress, and a lack of work-life balance could exacerbate students' mental health problems. However, something that really bothered me about all of these studies is that they never had actually talked to grad students before they made up their surveys. They were not doing the exploratory qualitative work with grad students first, so some of the factors were clearly missing. And I think you'll agree with me that specific aspects of research that might affect mental health were absent, as well as teaching. Teaching was entirely absent, right, from this list of things affecting mental health. And so this led my lab to really want to better understand the relationship between mental health, namely anxiety and depression, and research and teaching. So our research questions driving this work were, how do symptoms of depression and anxiety affect grad student experiences in research and in teaching? And then in turn, how do research and teaching alleviate or exacerbate grad student symptoms of depression and anxiety? So I want to highlight that we had no interest in actually understanding the etiologies of anxiety and depression. That was far too complex, and I'm going to leave that to the psychiatrists and the psychologists. But we really wanted to understand what affected these symptoms. So with regard to depression, common symptoms include sadness, emptiness, and hopelessness, irritability or frustration, loss of interest or pleasure, being tired or lacking energy, and feeling worthless or guilty. When it comes to anxiety, common symptoms include persistent worry, perceiving situations and events as threatening, fearing making the wrong decision, and an inability to relax. All right, so I wanted to situate this work within the feedback loop of depression and anxiety. And this feedback loop suggests that depression and anxiety can have a negative impact on life events. And then in turn, those life events, particularly if they're negative, often go forward and exacerbate depression and anxiety. However, the relationship between life events and depression and anxiety can be dependent on how one attributes life events. So how one attributes negative life events can, in times, exacerbate depression and anxiety, particularly if you think that the negative outcome is due to something about your own inherent characteristics. That's what we call an internal attribution. If you perceive that a negative outcome is caused by something that's never going to change, that's a stable attribution. And if you perceive a negative outcome is going to affect many different situations in your life, that would be a global attribution. So we see, that if you perceive outcomes as both stable and global, you're going to assume that they're going to continue to happen, and that would engender feelings of hopelessness leading to more depressive symptoms. If you perceive negative outcomes as uncontrollable, that's going to engender helplessness, which again is going to exacerbate anxiety. All right, so I'd like you to take a look at this quote here from this student, and in a second I'm going to ask you to turn to somebody around you and chat with them about what two of these three attributions do you recognize in this quote. So this student says, half of the students in my TA section failed the exam. It's clearly because I suck at teaching ecology. I'm never going to get an instructor job. So go ahead and turn to your neighbor, introduce yourself if you haven't met them before, and talk with them about which two of these attributions are present in this quote. So it should get really loud in here as you talk to your neighbor. Okay. So if you're online, you're welcome to go ahead and contribute your thoughts to the chat. But here in person, I want you to show me with your fingers in a second which attributions you think are present. So you can use both of your hands to show me which two attributions you think are present. So 1, 2, 3, go ahead and show me. All right, I'm seeing lots of ones, and then I'm seeing a mixture between 2 and 3. All right, so let's compare. All right, so I'm going to argue for 1 and 3, but I'll talk to folks who thought about 2 in a second because I hear you. So first of all, we all agreed on 1, right? This internal attribution that students are failing the exam because the TA sucks at teaching. That's just a part of who they are. That's not going to change. The global attribution is that this very specific event, right, is then being applied to other aspects of their job. They're thinking all the way down the line to this means I'm never going to get hired as an instructor. If you were folks who were thinking stable, I'm going to give it to you, right? I'm never going to get an instructor job. They're thinking that this is not going to change anytime soon. All right, the good news is that how one attributes life events can also help alleviate depression and anxiety. So for example, if you attribute a negative outcome to an outside cause that's not related to something internal to you, that is an external attribution. If you attribute a negative outcome to a temporary cause, that would be an unstable attribution. And if you can recognize that that negative event is specific and you're not trying to apply it to different situations in your life, that would be a specific attribution. All right, so perceiving negative outcomes as both temporary and specific engenders hope, which is then protective against depression. And then perceiving future negative outcomes as controllable is going to help lessen our anxiety. So let's take a look at another quote. This TA says, half of the students in my TA section failed the exam, probably because they didn't study. I'll coordinate study groups next time. So turn back to your neighbor and identify which two attributions are present in this quote. So it should get loud in here as you chat through this quote with your neighbor. All right, so let's go ahead and come back together. Again, if you're online, feel free to contribute your guesses to the chat. If you're in person, when I count to 3, you're going to show me again with your hands what your thoughts are. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. All All right, lots of ones, lots of 2, 3s, but a lot of 2s. All right, so let's see here. So I agree with you. External, they're like, oh, it's probably because the student doesn't study that they're failing. So I want to be clear that I'm not champion external attributions for all TAs, but this is a way to think about protecting your mental health, not about necessarily becoming the best teacher. And then 2, the unstable, they're just going to coordinate study groups next time, right? Something they can totally change. And if you thought maybe 3, I'll buy the fact that just because they're by omission, right? They're not talking about some globalization of this idea and how it's going to affect them long term. All right, so situating our research within these theories, we hypothesized that symptoms of anxiety and depression were going to have a negative impact on research and teaching. And this was largely based on findings in the literature by Grabinger et al., as well as work that my graduate student, Tasneem Mohammed, has done, showing that depression and anxiety can negatively affect our cognitive domains, like our working memories, which then, of course, would negatively impact your experiences in research and teaching. We also hypothesized that research and teaching could have a negative impact on depression and anxiety, particularly if those situations in research and teaching were engendering hopelessness and helplessness in students. Conversely, there are instances in where experiences in research and teaching could have a positive impact on depression and anxiety if those experiences were engendering hope and control. All right, so how did we do this study? We tackled our research questions with the sequential mixed method study, and we began with interview studies, right? Because we really wanted to hear from our grad students, and we used those interview studies to inform a national survey study. All right, so starting with our qualitative interview studies, my current graduate student, Nick Wiesenthal, and former graduate student, Logan Jin, conducted a set of 50 interviews with PhD students with depression across 28 life sciences programs. Nick joined with undergraduate researcher Lindsay Kennedy, conducted 33 PhD student interviews with students with anxiety across 22 life sciences programs. They inductively coded the interviews to answer our research questions and came to an accepted inter-rater reliability. And then Nick coded the remaining interviews for both of these studies. All right. This is my graduate student, Carly Bush. She joined Nick, and they were tasked with going through all of the interviews and using those to create a survey. So what they did is they identified the different ways in which students talked about depression and anxiety affecting their research, and the different ways that students identified depression and anxiety affecting teaching. Then they went through and found the aspects of research that could exacerbate depression and anxiety and the aspects of research that could alleviate depression and anxiety. And often these same aspects came up in both the depression and anxiety interviews. And then they did the same for teaching. So it's important to note that for each of these aspects of research and teaching, we asked all students on the survey, on average throughout grad school career, how often have you experienced it, right? And they could tell us that they've never experienced it or they're experiencing it weekly. We also asked for students with depression, on average, to what extent does this particular aspect of research or teaching worsen or in some case lessen your depression? And we did the same with anxiety. In addition, we collected information about their depression and anxiety. So notably, we never ask students or require students to be diagnosed to participate in our studies. And that's because we know that mental health care is disproportionately unavailable to Black, Latine, and individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. But we do always collect information about their formal diagnosis and use other means to assess their anxiety and depression, such as the PHQ-9 and GAD-7 scales. We collected teaching demographics, information about their research, and personal demographics. And we conducted a series of think aloud interviews with grad students who have depression and anxiety until we felt like all of the questions on our survey were being interpreted as we intended. So how did we recruit? We started by using the Carnegie classification to identify all US PhD and master's granting institutions. And from that, we have 1,429 total programs spanning biology, chemistry, geosciences, and physics. We contacted a director of the program for each of these programs, and we asked them to distribute our survey to grad students to assess how aspects of graduate programs affect their students' mental health. We were thrilled to have over 27 thesis-based master's or PhD students fill out our survey. They represented 37% of the institutions and 290 total programs. All right, so who are these students? So 77% of these students identified as having depression and answered questions about the relationship between their depression and research. Now keep in mind, we were very open with the grad student the people who sent out our survey that we were recruiting students for a mental health study, so we're very much likely oversampling in this case, but that was the point. People have already determined the percentage of grad students who have anxiety and depression, but we wanted to know about their experiences. 72% of folks identified as having anxiety and were asked questions about their anxiety in research. And as you'll note, there's quite an overlap. And indeed, these are very comorbid conditions. 63% of our participants identified as having both anxiety and depression. 83% of both of these groups had taught in some way when they were taking our survey. And so they were all asked about the relationship between their respective depression, anxiety, and teaching. Additionally, our sample was primarily women, white, continuing generation college going, split with financial stability, with 48% of students saying that they do not always feel financially stable. 26% of our sample was LGBTQ+, 20% identified as international, and then they span the fields of study with the majority of students coming from biology. And 78% of students were PhD students, and the remainder were coming from master's programs. All right, so we at first want to know who's most likely to report having depression and anxiety. So what we found from our data was that women, financially unstable students, LGBTQ+ students, non-international compared to international students were more likely to report depression. With regard to anxiety, both non-binary and women were more likely to report anxiety compared to men. White students were more likely to report anxiety compared to Asian students. Financially unstable students, as well as LGBTQ+ students, were more likely to report anxiety. And then biology students compared to chemistry students were more likely to report anxiety. All right, so I do want to remind us all that cultural stigma and inadequate access to mental health care may be masking some health struggles, particularly among Asian, Black, Latin, and international students. So mental health is something that's really difficult to study and quantify, so it's always important to keep this in mind when interpreting these results. We were also really interested in whether grad students actually leave their program, right? It's very much presumed that students who are miserable are not going to stick around. And so we were curious, and indeed, both depression and anxiety significantly predicted that a student had seriously considered leaving their graduate program. And then, of course, we want to know, but did they actually leave, right? And this is my grad student, Jinx Piggart. She just came from East Carolina to Arizona State to actually study this as part of her GRFP. She's going to be doing longitudinal studies with students to understand how their anxiety changes from year to year, and then what actually happens, whether they persist or whether they leave. And so I always get questions about that, but now we'll have answers, but in a few years, unfortunately. So why is understanding the relationship between mental health and grad school so important? Well, of course, we want to decrease mental health struggles among grads, right? And particularly, especially since we know that this affects women, financially unstable students, and LGBTQ+ students disproportionately. So we argue that if students with anxiety and depression may be more likely to leave their science grad programs, then understanding this relationship between research and teaching and anxiety and depression is an integral step to creating a more diverse and inclusive scientific community. All right, so I'm going to dive into our findings now, and what I'm going to show you are statistics and figures that come from the survey studies, and I'm going to support those statistics and figures with quotes from the interview studies. All right, so let's start with this first research question. How do symptoms of depression and anxiety affect grad students' experiences in research and teaching? Let's start with depression. So these are the categories that emerged from our interviews and then the results from our survey once students could select whether their depression actually affected this aspect of research. So we found that 88% of students identified that a lack of motivation, that depression could cause a lack of motivation, which hindered their research productivity. For example, Cameron, who has depression, said, depression keeps me from doing the things that I want to do every single day, like reading a paper or writing for an hour every day. I'm so exhausted, I feel like I can't do those things, and depression increases procrastination. 83% of students identified that their depression made it difficult to concentrate during research, and 65% said that depression can make them overly critical of themselves or feel like they have low self-esteem. So for example, Lucy explains, my depression brings on this imposter syndrome, I think. What am I doing in this program? I'm constantly struggling and battling those thoughts, never feeling like I fit in, struggling with, am I good enough? Is what I'm doing good enough? Should I even stay in this program? All right, now how do symptoms of depression affect teaching? 65% of students said it negatively affects their energy. Ainsley says, there's been times where I've just been unable to prep for classes or prep very little just because I'm just struggling with myself and trying to get through things. It upsets me because I feel like I'm letting the undergrads down. Encouragingly, we thought, right, that depression was going to exclusively have a negative impact on teaching and research, but here you can see 61% of students said that their depression actually helped them better understand undergraduates' mental health challenges and made them more empathetic. Marcel explains, my depression makes me a little more empathetic with the undergraduates that I teach, and I know that since depression is a big deal for me, it might be just as big of a deal for them. I'm able to empathize better and help people seek out the right resources if necessary. 37% of students said that they feel disconnected from undergrads when teaching. Okay, so now that we've thought about the impact of depression on research and teaching, what about anxiety? 81% of students said that anxiety can cause them to avoid research tasks, which ultimately hinders productivity. For example, Morgan said, my anxiety will just make me freeze with my research. I won't get work done because I'll just go over all of the possible issues with my research over and over and over. 57% of students said, it makes me more detail-oriented, but that causes me to spend too much time on my research. And then encouragingly, 57% of students also recognize that being detail-oriented and being diligent actually results in high-quality products. So again, anxiety wasn't all bad when it came to research. But what about teaching? So again, we see this positive outcome. 70% of students said that because of their own anxiety, they're more understanding of their undergraduates' mental health. But 54% highlighted that it could result in a lack of productivity. For example, Ella says, my anxiety makes it harder to get teaching-related tasks done sometimes. Productivity might be the biggest one. When I'm having a really hard time or a bad time, I don't have the bandwidth to do anything else besides trying to feel better. But 54% of students again brought up that being detailed-oriented and diligent, and that resulted in good teaching. Carrie explains, anxiety always causes me to strive for a little bit more. Try to be a little bit better so that I'm more prepared and be a little more ready to handle whatever comes my way when teaching undergraduates. All right, so our hypothesis was partially correct, right? We did see that depression and anxiety could hinder students' experiences in research and teaching, namely because it negatively affected motivation, productivity, and self-esteem. But we also found that there are instances in which depression and anxiety can be an asset to research and teaching, particularly because it causes people to be more compassionate as well as more diligent. All right, now what about this reciprocal of the relationship? How do research and teaching affect our depression and anxiety? So let's go ahead and start with research and how it exacerbates depression and anxiety. So what I'm going to do here is show you all of the aspects of research that emerged from the interviews with regard to negatively affecting depression and anxiety. So we have negative reinforcement, which is receiving overly harsh criticism or feedback about research, being scolded or yelled at by a mentor. Having a lack of technical support, so receiving very little advising or mentoring, or regularly not having your questions adequately answered. Students also talked about having unreasonable expectations. This could be a lot of hours in the lab, lots of papers, lots of grants, or simply advisors having expectations that the students know they're never going to be able to meet. Social isolation, so although grad school can seem like a not lonely place, they highlighted that you can feel really lonely and isolated in grad school and have a lack of connections with others in the lab. And experiencing failure, so this was a broad definition. It encompassed experiencing failures, obstacles, setbacks, such as grant rejections, papers getting rejected, experiments failing, etc. And one we heard a ton about, comparing yourselves to others. So grad students talked a ton about instances where they felt inadequate after comparing themselves to their peers. All right, so I'm going to take a second to break down this graph because I'm going to show it a few times here. And what we have on the Y, so what we have over here on the x-axis is the average number of times per year that grad students, they reported they experienced an aspect of research that exacerbates their anxiety and depression. What we have on the y-axis is the average rating of the extent to which an aspect of research exacerbates their depression or anxiety. All right, so I'm also only going to show you data from students who had completed at least 2 years of graduate school because we didn't want that to skew the number of times students experience any particular aspect of grad school. The blue dots represent aspects that exacerbate depression, and the green dots represent aspects that exacerbate anxiety. All right, so here we go. So you can see them all plotted up on here, and what I'm going to ask you to do is turn to your neighbor or contribute to the chat, and I want you to discuss, to improve student mental health, which of these aspects is most pressing and why? All right, so go ahead and turn to your neighbor, take a second to interpret this graph, and then chat about which of these aspects is most pressing to address and why. Okay, so let's go ahead and come back together. So first of all, if you were struggling, I get asked this question all the time. I do not have an answer for you. What I did see is, I always know I have a lot of scientists in the room when we start like bisecting the graph, right? And showing me where you're looking. And that's exactly how we started to think about this, right? We started to think about, all right, what are the factors that are having the most severe impact on anxiety and depression? But you also might want to think about what are the aspects that students are experiencing most frequently, right? Even something that isn't necessarily having a huge, severe impact on depression, a lot of tiny cuts are still going to make an impact. And so although I'd love to talk with you about all of these different things today, I'm going to use this kind of orange quadrant here to focus on 3 of these concepts. So experiencing failure, social isolation, and opportunities to compare self to others, because these all seem to have a noticeable impact on the severity of students' depression, but were also being experienced relatively frequently. All right, so failures, obstacles, and setbacks. 94% of students with depression identified that this could exacerbate their depression. Hallie explains, everything fails and you have 0 positive results and nothing you can publish. The stress of knowing that you're failing is really bad for depression. 98% of our students with anxiety acknowledge that failing can exacerbate symptoms of anxiety. Carter explains, my anxiety is exacerbated anytime something doesn't work in research, which is most of the time. I think that adds to, oh, I'm just not doing this right because I can't do it. All right, so we see an internal attribution here, right? He's just not doing this right because he can't do it. So totally internalized. And then we were laughing right at that stable attribution. It's not working, which is most of the time, right? So we're not seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. We're not seeing this as something that's going to change. All right, what about social isolation? So 92% of students with depression acknowledge that social isolation can be tough for their symptoms. Jaden said, doing research is very isolating because obviously not many people go for PhDs. I can't talk to my friends about research struggles because they're like, okay, how do I fix that? You did that to yourself. And I'm like, I mean, you're right, but nobody understands you. So first of all, I think we all can agree Jaden needs some new friends because they are very much encouraging this internal attribution. You did this to yourself, right? This was your choice and this is why you're experiencing it, and that this is stable. So, right, because they're basically explaining there's nothing we can do to help you, right? This isn't necessarily going to change. 84% of students said that social isolation can affect their anxiety. So as we'd expect, it's more so affecting students with depression, but still very prominent among students with anxiety. Charlotte says, in my second year of my graduate program, I actually moved out to a marine lab away from campus. So I was very isolated. I started performing pretty poorly, and without the social interactions, that would exacerbate my anxiety. All right, and finally, comparing selves to others. So this could affect depression in 91% of students. Nevaeh said, I think that I'm a huge person that compares themselves to others. When I hear others speak about their research or their progress, though it may not be light years away from mine, it feels that way. I get sad, I feel like I'm not where I'm supposed to be or that I don't deserve to be in this program. So this is a textbook example of a global attribution, right? We have this student comparing presumably to one other student. But because they personally don't feel like they're measuring up, they're questioning whether they deserve to be in their program. And again, I said we heard about this a lot. So for example, Mitch says, comparing yourself to others is also what's hard about grad school for my anxiety, because it's not like you're going through the same steps at the same time with people like in past school experiences. It's all on your own. And sometimes when you compare yourself, it's scary because I'm like, am I doing the right research? Should I be getting this PhD? Am I getting enough done? So again, these global attributions can be really overwhelming, right? For students and for an advisor to realize that you may have a student that's comparing themselves to one other student who may not even be that great, who may be far worse than your student, and yet they are considering that they are not necessarily meant to be in a particular program. All right, so now that we've talked about how research can exacerbate anxiety and depression, I want to talk about how it might alleviate anxiety and depression. So students talked about how making progress on research can be really impactful and good for their mental health, as well as receiving emotional support, so people being understanding, expressing sympathy, or caring about students' overall well-being. Students talked about how completing small tasks, being able to check things off your list every week, right, can be really helpful, as well as actually caring about your research, feeling passionate about what you're doing every day. All right, so here's our graph again. And what we're going to do is I want you to turn to your neighbor and I'm going to ask you to predict which quadrant each of these four aspects falls into. So which quadrant does research progress fall into, emotional support, completing small tasks, and feeling a passion for research. So go ahead and turn to your neighbor, predict which quadrant each aspect will fall into. If you're online, go ahead and predict in the chat. And I only want you to discuss depression. We'll talk about anxiety, but only discuss depression. So I'll ask you to compare what you chatted about. Everyone's excited. All right. We get to see where these dots actually lie. So compare what you chatted about with your neighbor or what you typed into the chat to what students actually reported. So starting with research progress, we see that in the second quadrant. All right. So it's happening, about once a month, not too frequently, but it is having a noticeable impact on depression and anxiety. What about emotional support? How often are students experiencing that emotional support? All right, so unfortunately, this was still kind of in the second quadrant because they're experiencing it, again, about once a month. But again, it's having a relatively noticeable impact for them as they're reporting it on their depression and anxiety. Completing small tasks, where do we think that's going to land? 3. All right. So yeah, so this was really interesting because I think 4, we think about, maybe it's not going to have that big of an impact, but students actually reported that it has, more than somewhat of an impact, potentially more on anxiety than depression, but it's happening often. So again, that's something that we can go to relatively frequently to hopefully be protective of mental health. And then finally, feeling a passion for research. Student says that this affects them a little bit more than once a year and having, again, a relatively noticeable impact on their depression and anxiety. All right. So what we see is that encouragingly, all 4 of these ended up having a relatively substantial impact of severity. But then when we thought about where do we want to focus our attention, we thought about for things that are going well, that are protected, we may want to think about the things that our students aren't experiencing that much, right? Because maybe that's where the room for growth is. And that would be research progress and emotional support. All right, so with regard to research progress, 93% of students said that this could be helpful for their depressive symptoms. Lou said, I will say something that helps my depression is when you're working really hard on the experiment and then you finally get good data. That makes all of my effort worth it. You can hear this external attribution, right? Because she's attributing the good data to effort, right? So not something that's internally part of her, but something that she has more control over, which would be effort. Anxiety, 98% of students said that research progress can positively affect their anxiety. Mark said, even though I get extremely overwhelmed during portions of research, making progress really helps me kind of calm down and kind of self-evaluate that I'm making progress and moving forward. So when I get overwhelmed, making progress helps me relieve some of that anxiety. And what's so interesting here is we have this student using this positive example to use an unstable attribution when they're not making any progress, right? So then they're able to think when they're not making any progress, oh, I know this isn't going to last forever because there are instances where I do make progress. With regard to emotional support, 91% of students said that it could alleviate their depressive symptoms. Kai said, if I didn't have the advisors that I have now, I don't know that I would be able to proceed through getting a PhD because I've been able to be very open with them about my mental health struggles and the reality of how mental illness affects me and affects my life and my productivity. And they haven't really rigorously pushed me beyond my stated limitations. 96% of students said that emotional support helped alleviate their anxiety. Blaine said, my PI and I have a very open communication and I can ask him any question and not feel criticism, which makes me feel a lot less anxious because I have someone I can communicate with. And he's also really supportive, which is really helpful for my anxiety. All right, so in conclusion here, we saw that research could both exacerbate depression and anxiety, particularly if it engenders helplessness and hopelessness by causing social isolation, social comparisons, and failures. But it could also have an alleviating effect because things like emotional support and research progress help engender hope and control in students. All right, but what about teaching? So different than research, what we found for teaching is a lot of the things that exacerbate and alleviate depression and anxiety were paired. So for example, we had students saying that a lack of teacher training could exacerbate their depression because they feel they weren't trained well enough to teach, but if they had confidence in their teaching, that could alleviate depression and anxiety. For example, Stacy explains, my depression worsened because I was concerned about the lack of supervision and the lack of support for how to teach. I just felt like I was always doing a terrible job, which was really discouraging. And again, you can see the stable attribution. She's always doing a terrible job. With regard to enforcement, we had negative reinforcement come through, so comments or behaviors from undergrads that are rude, disrespectful, or show disengagement. But we also had a lot of talk about positive reinforcement. So this was really different from research. I didn't say a word about positive reinforcement in research, right? We talked about emotional support, but no positive reinforcement because it did not come up in the interviews, presumably because it's not happening. But positive reinforcement is happening in teaching. Comments or behaviors from undergrads that are encouraging or show engagement. For example, Juliana says, I feel like if students are engaged in asking questions and seeming at ease and seeming excited, those are all good signs that teaching is going well, and it makes me feel less anxious than when things aren't going well. So again, this is a great example that when things aren't going well, right, she can lean on this experience to do an unstable attribution, to remember that if things aren't going that well, it's not always going to be bad. There have been instances where things have gone great. And then we have this interesting parallel. So students talked a ton about how teaching creates this increase in responsibilities, perceiving teaching as a responsibility that takes time away from research. Again, we never heard research talked about in this way, right? Research was never responsible for taking time away from teaching. It's always the other way around. But in the same breath, these same students would say, but teaching can relieve stress because it acts as this respite, right? It can be really stressed in research and then move to teaching and feel like it gives them a break. And then finally, we also heard about the importance of being passionate about teaching or just simply enjoying teaching. Forrest explains, I really like teaching, actually. I think it's really fun to interact with undergrads. And we often get to do some more fun activities that I get to plan something that's not just research material. I get to really interact with the students, which I think mitigates anxiety symptoms for me. All right, so what we can see here is everything's plotted out. And what you'll maybe notice is that teaching appears to have a more negative impact on anxiety compared to depression, right? So we see those green dots kind of well above the blue dots. So that was just an interesting observation for us. Additionally, when you look at the severe negative effects that some of these teaching aspects are having on anxiety and depression, you'll notice that only 2 are kind of falling into this upper quadrant. So this leads us to think that teaching may have less of a negative impact on mental health compared to research. All right, so here are the positive factors. Here are the factors that alleviate depression and anxiety, and they're kind of all over each other, right? There's no separation here. So the positive impact of teaching seems to be similar for depression and for anxiety. And then whether teaching or research has more of a positive impact on mental health is less clear. So you'll notice it's maybe not having as much of a positive impact in terms of severity. However, they're experiencing these things much more frequently. So it's tough to kind of make a call and say what's more important, right? Those are questions for more research. All right, so what we identified was that teaching could exacerbate symptoms of depression and anxiety, particularly things like lack of teaching training and increased responsibilities can engender hopelessness and helplessness. But there are aspects of teaching like confidence and getting positive reinforcements from students, which engender hope and control and can dampen those symptoms of depression and anxiety. All right, so takeaways. We found that women, financially unstable students, and LGBTQ+ students disproportionately report both depression and anxiety. That students with depression and anxiety are more likely to seriously consider leaving their graduate programs. Depression and anxiety primarily hinder experiences in teaching and research, but can afford students compassion and diligence. And then aspects of research exacerbate grad depression and anxiety. Aspects of teaching primarily exacerbate grad anxiety, but there are aspects of research and teaching that can alleviate depression and anxiety. So where do we go from here? What can we do to improve grad mental health? And every time I give this talk, I revise this section, because when I talk purely about what mentors can do, when I talk purely about what students can do for their mental health, they tell me that we should really be talking about mentors. When I talk about mentors, we get asked what we should do for students. So I'm doing my best to kind of do a half and half. So let's start with thinking about enhancing the structure and the training. So Beth Schuessler, who is a researcher in our field, has some really great research out showing that most mandatory teaching prep is less than 10 hours per year, and grads are always requesting more pedagogical information and teaching observations. But as we improve how we're training grads to teach, we're going to enhance their teaching self-efficacy, which we would expect would then decrease their anxiety. There are also great documents out there for folks looking to strengthen their mentoring. So this was just published, I think last year, from the National Academies, The Science of Effective Mentorship. Folks at University of Wisconsin-Madison have put together great programs, both entering mentoring and entering research for students to get a sense for how to mentor more effectively and how to be mentored more effectively. And then for grads, our recommendation is to request more structure, right? Recognizing that you need structure is a huge plus, right? And I think it's really hard for people to recognize often that they benefit from increased structure. But asking for things like direct feedback, asking for things like deadlines, even though you maybe don't want them, but recognize that they're going to help you in terms of knowing what you need to do next, and then outlining concrete tasks. So actually asking for some of these things can be really effective. All right, promoting student success and coping with failure. So from our major science journals, we know that scientific progress is built on failure, and they love to tell us about it, but that's usually where the conversation stops. So we really encourage normalizing failures. And a way that students talked about it in the interviews that was really effective for them was when their PI actually shared their own failures. And it became really clear to us that students often perceive their PIs as people who have never failed, people who have had really easy kind of paths to where they are. And then their PI would talk about a time that they've failed, and it was really impactful in helping that student recognize that, oh, this is normal, this is something that everybody goes through. I also recommend being strategic about opportunities for success, so especially when we get grads or even undergrads, right? In those early years, it's really hard to come up with a successful project right away. There's probably going to be a lot of failure. So can we get students on projects with high rates of success or a high chance of succeeding that they can work on, maybe on the side while they're also kind of struggling with their own larger research program, so that they can experience some success amid the failures? Additionally, coming from the student side, I think that this is really hard to do, to learn to cope with failure. We certainly weren't taught how to do this in undergrad. We're taught the opposite. So my lab is collaborating with the Lab for Scalable Mental Health, and we have an NSF grant to develop these single session interventions to help grads cope with challenging aspects of grad school. Because we can't take failure away. We know that failure is going to be around as a postdoc, as a faculty member. We can't take PIs away that are going to constantly negative reinforce. So how do we actually help students begin to cope with failure, critique, and isolation? So these will be 30-minute self-guided online interventions that promote these adaptive coping skills. And what we're most excited about is they're accessible and scalable. So they should be able to be accessed anywhere, at any time, with an internet connection for free. So these are in the works, but hopefully they'll be available in the next couple of years. Bolstering emotional support. So a while back, Liz and I collaborated with Sarah Brownell and Logan Jin on this paper exploring the study of students with depression in undergraduate research experiences. And something that came out of that paper that was also very relevant to the paper that, or to this study, was that students really valued praise. And I could tell you, or I could just read you this quote to explain why. The interviewer says, "Why is hearing praise from your mentor helpful?" And Maura says, "Because a lot of my depression focuses on everybody secretly hates you, nobody likes you, you're going to die alone. So having that validation from my graduate mentor is important because it flies in the face of what my depression tells me." And I'm a huge proponent of, if you're going to take the time to praise your grad student or your undergraduate researcher, please take the time to do it in writing, whether that's a text or an email. Because we found time and time again that grad students and undergrads referenced going back through their emails to find that positive praise from their mentor, to read it on days that were hard for them. So if you really want to be strategic, send it in writing, and then it will be effective more than that just initial time, which is super cool. And then grads positively reinforce what's helpful for you in your mental health. I think mentors often struggle about what to do. They'll try something, they don't really know if it worked, right? And so saying something as simple as, thanks for that positive feedback. I'm pretty hard on myself, so hearing that from you is really helpful, right? It doesn't require you to have a whole conversation about how you're really hard on yourself, but just telling them that, praise once in a while does some good things for me, can also tell your PI what's working for you and what's not. And then finally, altering the culture of science and normalizing talking about mental health. So my grad student Carly collected these data this year from 1,400 faculty. So this is a national sample of science faculty, and you can see about 30% identify as having depression, 35-ish% identify as having anxiety. The blue dot and the green dot are the percentages of students who identify as having depression and anxiety from the Evans paper I showed you on the first slide. So if you're thinking, okay, how many people do I know in the academy with depression and anxiety? You're probably thinking this doesn't really align with this. That's because when we look at who actually talks about their depression and anxiety, it drops. So 5% of people are talking to their students about their anxiety, and less than that are talking about their depression. So the reality is, we need to change the culture of science to become more comfortable sharing our own mental health struggles with our graduate students, so it becomes more normed, because the gap isn't actually that big. But when you look at how represented people are in terms of looking kind of out at the professoriate, it's a really big gap. These recommendations will hopefully help most students. So if you're thinking, these are great for all students, not just for students with anxiety and depression, we agree with you. And with that, we'd like to thank my tremendous research team, Nick, Carly, Logan, Lindsay, and Izzy, and the Cooper Bioed Lab, and of course, all of the amazing grad students who were so generous and shared their thoughts with us in both the interview study and the survey study. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Katie.
I have a comment about the impact of your work and then a question. So, as a postdoc, those who don't know me, I'm in faculty chemistry. As a postdoc, I still attended my PhD advisor's group meetings, and we read one of your early papers about this, and it was very cathartic. I just want to tell you, we got to tell our advisor some of the things that he had done in the past, like that indirect praise. So he would we would have combined meetings with another deeper group, and the biggest praise I got from him was, oh, the other professor said you did really well in group meeting. And he never realized that. And so it has been really impactful in his group thinking about what to do in terms of structure or in terms of helping students, because he didn't realize that almost all of his students were depressed or anxious. It was very obvious to us. So that's the comment. My question is, when doing this research, what has been one or two things that you have changed as a mentor, learning about what helps your students?
100%. Thank you for that question. The first thing was praise. So I was definitely the first person to come up with 15 things that I'm in such mode of thinking about the research and what we can do to make the research better. And here are 15 things we can do to make the research better. And I talk so highly, if anyone knows me, I talk so highly about my students, and I'm always so overly impressed with my students, but I was never turning to them and saying, first of all, let's start this meeting off, you're doing amazing, or you're exactly where you want to be, right? And I got that changed, and I started being more intentional about sending those emails as well, and making sure that praise was going in person. So that was a big change for me, because I'm not by nature a praiser, so I had to change that. The other thing that I would say is, I would say I've relaxed compared to how I was trained, in terms of I increase my flexibility, I will say, right? And recognizing that students can take mental health days and are often very reluctant to tell you their mental health days. And so I say straight up front, if you need to take a mental health day, absolutely fine. If you want to lie to me about it, absolutely fine. Tell me you have the flu. Tell me you have COVID. I don't care. I don't need to know, right? Just tell me you're sick, because it's the same exact thing. So I really encourage my students to treat mental health like physical health, and hopefully, right, it's had a difference. It's hard to tell, but those are two things that I've definitely changed, and my eyes have been opened because of this work. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for such a great talk. I'm just curious. I don't know if you've been allowed to ask that question. We have your questionnaire with the students. But I was just wondering, do you ask them if they take medication for the anxiety, depression? Do their answers much more different than the people who doesn't take medication to help relieve some of the anxiety and depression?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, do we ask if students take medication? We absolutely do. So they can always decline to state. So we ask them how they're treating their depression and their anxiety with therapy, with medication. Another way, prefer not to answer, not treated. I haven't looked at how treatment actually impacts some of this, but I could, and I would predict that you're spot on, that students who are treated with medication may be seeing a lesser impact on some of these things on their depression or anxiety. Yes?
So, in your data from national data, have you ever heard about the types of universities that students attend affect their mental health, like having more pressure to the university, like top universities versus average universities?
That's a great question. We have not looked at that. We do have their institutions, so we could go and look at rankings per se and use that as a proxy for like eliteness, right, or competitiveness, and see. And I think that would be potentially really interesting. And I think what we may see is a wash. We may see there's some stress at really competitive institutions, but that's maybe driven by different things than the stress that's driven at less competitive institutions. But I think that's an interesting question and something we can definitely look at given the data set. Yeah.
Just curious if you've looked at the impact of being a traditional versus a non-traditional grad student, also whether or not students have a spouse or someone at home, children, or other people that are financially dependent.
That's a good question. We should have caregiver status in that data set, but what I am really interested in the data that we don't have, that if I were to go back I would really want to collect, is whether students are going into their grad program straight out of undergrad or they've taken time off, because I think that changes oftentimes what your perspective is and what you want out of your program. But yeah, I would assume that what we would see is greater outside stressors are going to both increase the impacts of these things on both anxiety and depression. Not that having a family is automatically an outside stressor, right, but it is additional responsibility. Yeah?
I was just wondering about one of the possible interventions being shifting expectations. Maybe that falls under enhancing structured training. But when you mention like failed experiments and stuff, I think about like collecting data and failing to reject a hypothesis, not necessarily the experiment going wrong. So I wonder how much of the failure that you're seeing is, legitimate problems conducting an experiment, or I noticed the good data, bad data, I don't really fall, because that's a good descriptor for term data. But and I also was wondering about, I guess the bigger question that I had was when the survey was conducted.
So the survey was conducted this past spring, so spring of 21, right? Okay. Yeah, 22. Spring of 22. To your other question, in the interviews, we did hear about both types of, quote, failure, right? Instances where things didn't work, data that were trying to be collected for months ended up not being able to be collected. And then we also had, I've been working on this project for 3 months and found out that my protein doesn't do what we thought it was going to do, and now this is pretty useless and no one wants to hear about it, right? And we categorize both of those things as failure in the survey study, but I recognize that they are different things, and you may have to tweak some of your mindset in a different way to think about how to cope with those things. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of the things that as we work to create these single session interventions, particularly on failure, we want to differentiate between and get students really thinking about what are the different ways, what do I struggle with most essentially, and what do I want to work through. This one's going to cut us off.
Questions, but let's thank Dr. Cooper again.
What a great presentation. Hi, I'm Kim Sadler. We're next door.
Oh, awesome.
And Liz and I share group experiences. This is number 3 this year. I walked into a chest, into a dresser. We just got carpeting. Oh, stupid.
Oh, at least you're actually walking into something. My ankle just like gives.
Yeah, thank God. I mean, I could think, of course, careful walking around here because we've got all these drops on our sidewalk. At any rate, but totally enjoyed it. And, you know, just so pleased for all your successes. I know other people want to talk to you today. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, you too.
I was just gonna
Hi. Sorry, I'm so traveling. I don't want to talk in everyone's face. So I haven't sent out my PowerPoint yet because my data aren't published yet. So I haven't been sending it around yet, but I'm happy to send you any specific thing you want to look at.
Can I give you my, or can I get your number?
Yeah, sure. It's my first name, so Caitlin, Katey,
I'll talk to you later.
dot Cooper at ASU.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, they take attendance for our points, so that's why I thought he usually marks those.
And you're gonna take her to the next destination for lunch, right?
Real quick.
Yeah.
You mentioned how reporting and stuff and how social stigmas, and I just thought that maybe men should be added to that group, just in general. You know, 'cause a lot of times, I'm not supposed to be depressed. I'm not supposed to have anxiety.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to just suck it up and do it.
Right.
You know, and
Yeah.
I just noticed, in that group, I felt like maybe we should. And then also is health care, mental health being provided to people in lower income. Well, I think that's every grad student, right?
Potentially. It depends. I think it depends on what your familial background is and how much your parents would be willing to help you, right? I think that there's, a fair number of students whose parents, I think, are willing to pay for therapy or things, or whose spouses, right, or financially.
That's where that other question kind of
But with men, I agree. I think we tried to point out people who we would expect may almost, you see the complete reverse and may actually have higher levels of anxiety than the comparison group. But with men, it's always been really debatable whether they have less anxiety or they're just not reporting it because it's socially unacceptable. So I think that that's a good caveat to highlight.
2004. They're gonna walk over right now.
To make sure you're going the right place.
Yeah.
So it seems like white men who feel financially unstable.
Definitely.
It seems like not that big of a leap.
Right. Agree.
We're gonna take
We're going to lunch? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. And they'll go ahead and escort you over there,
Awesome.
and you'll come back for your break. They'll bring you over there too, okay?
Okay, perfect. And then that's just in your little interview room.
It's in
I
the
love your
interview
interview room with your beautiful window.
Thank you,
I
yeah.
would get nowhere. I just look like stare out the window. So cute. You know your people are gonna be relaxed.
I'm gonna have to send you a picture of when it snows. Oh, so nice.
You mean you're gonna have to bring me out here when it snows?
So, wait, so you mean I'm gonna get even less done in the winter? I'll be staring out the window.
Okay. So beautiful.
So beautiful is allowed.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Either Marshall